Fred Taylor and John Stuart Mill are utilitarians. This is the other main type of deontic ethics. You'll remember that deontic ethics is the type that worries about what actions we should take and tries to determine which actions are good and which are bad. Virtue ethics was concerned with what kind of people we should be and tries to determine what kinds of living are virtuous and which are vicious. Utilitarians are quite different from deontologists, though. Utilitarians are consequentialist. That is, for them, the rightness or wrongness of an action depends on the outcome or consequence of the act. Generally, of course, you have to want to do good in order to bring about good, but if you do something that accidentally brings about good, you've done good. For the purpose of ethically judging your actions, consequentialists don't worry about what reasons you had for taking the action, as long as it brings about good consequences. So what makes an action good? Utilitarians say it's the fact that the act brings about good consequences. A bad act is one that brings about bad consequences. So what counts as good? Utilitarians use pleasure as the most basic good. Remember, Kant's big concern, and a major concern of anyone seeking a real ethical principle, we're worried that judgments about good and bad will be determined by your particular upbringing, so they can only tell us what you happen to like, not a fundamental rule for how everyone should behave. Kant solves it by avoiding references to human behavior completely. That's part of why his reasoning is so abstract. Utilitarians have a different solution. They think that if we're looking for a universal ethical principle, we need an experience that's so fundamental to human experience of the world that it can be felt and understood by everyone, regardless of when or where they live. Everyone suffers from pain and enjoys pleasure. Therefore, good equals pleasure and bad equals pain or suffering. So the foundational ethical principle of utilitarianism is act so as to bring about the greatest good for the greatest number and to minimize suffering and pain for all concerned and, as far as possible, for all sentient beings. The most basic, straightforward type of utilitarianism is called act utilitarianism. It tells us to apply the basic principle, act so as to bring about the greatest good for the greatest number and minimize suffering and harm for all concerned and so far as possible for all sentient beings, directly to situations in which we're trying to determine what to do. Now, early utilitarians didn't distinguish among pleasures. My pleasure in drinking a beer and watching Real Housewives is equal to your pleasure in practicing your violin. Mill and most modern utilitarians reject this. Mill gave a higher value to pleasures that exercise the reason and imagination, and you can see the influence of Aristotle here. Pleasure that utilizes your essence is more valuable. Contemporary utilitarians argue further that other things are inherently and universally good in addition to pleasure, so that bringing about the most good would include things like bringing about greater knowledge, understanding, and friendship. And to capture this richer sense of pleasure, utilitarians often talk about welfare when they talk about bringing about the greatest good. What they mean is that we're trying to bring about the greatest human well-being. So let's take a look at how this works in practice. Here you are, wondering what to do in a particular situation. So a simple calculation of utility in act utilitarianism is to first imagine all the possible actions that are reasonably within your ability to do in the situation you're in. For each of those possible actions, calculate the likely units of utility produced, that is, figure out how many people's welfare will increase with that action. Calculate the likely units of disutility produced. That is, figure out how many people's welfare will decrease if you take that action. Subtract the disutility from the utility, and the act with the greatest net utility is the one that you should undertake. We should note that you should count your own welfare and that of your loved ones, but you can't give them more weight than anyone else's welfare. You should take degrees of welfare into account. Great pain or great pleasure can count more than minor pain or pleasure. And by and large, you try to produce the most welfare for those concerned in the action at hand, rather than trying to determine what's the best action for the whole wide world in that circumstance. So let's go ahead and take an example. Lots of you have already run into issues at your work, often issues where someone or a whole group of people is being treated unfairly, but where pushing for fair treatment will put you at risk of retaliation from management, maybe even losing your job. You'll remember from our earlier discussions that Kant thinks you have a duty to help, risk be damned, although it's an imperfect duty, so you don't always have to help. What would an act utilitarian think? First, we will need more detail. So let's say that you work in a small office. I'm keeping the number of people involved small to simplify our work in a minute. With a staff of 10 people, you've got an owner, a general manager, an office manager, and 7 employees, and you are one of the employees. Now, say that you've noticed that one of the other employees is getting treated differently from everyone else. As far as you can see, she performs equally to everyone else in the office, but people are holding her to higher standards, being less helpful when she needs help, being more critical of her work, and more quick to go to the manager when they do find fault with her work. Now say that you have also noticed that this employee, the one being treated unfairly, is a different race from everyone else. The unfairness bothers you, and the suspicion that it's the result of racial bias bothers you even more, so you start trying to gently talk to your coworkers and stick up for the coworker who's the victim of bias. Because you're outnumbered so strongly, though, this doesn't have much effect on their behavior. It's too easy to think of other reasons why they dislike the coworker, and they all have a million reasons why her work really is worse, enough to tell themselves that there's nothing wrong with their behavior. People are very good at rationalizing their behavior, especially when their friends are behaving the same way. So you are thinking about whether you should talk to your managers. But you notice that the managers and the owner also tend to be hypercritical, less willing to help, and quicker to complain about this employee. You also know that it will be tricky to bring this to their attention, as you have good reason to believe, having worked there for a while, having seen how they react to feedback, that they will take offense and retaliate against you. You also know, though, that they're very risk averse, and that they'd probably institute some kind of changes just because they'd be worried about a lawsuit. And let's assume that those changes would actually shield your coworker from the results of the biased treatment. So you'd probably be helping this woman by risking yourself. What would act utilitarianism tell you to do? First, we need to think about all the people involved. There's you, your dependents, if any. This is in case you get fired and lose your income. Your 5 biased coworkers, your 3 managers, and the 1 victim of discrimination. Next, we have to figure out what options are reasonably open to you in this situation. For simplicity's sake, let's say there's 2. You might decide to keep your mouth shut and say nothing, or you might decide to approach management. Now we determine the likely net utility created from your action. Let's work backwards and take the approach management option first. To keep this simple, let's assume that you've got a good beat on your managers and that they are very likely to be offended if you provide even very diplomatic feedback suggesting that they're unconsciously biased against your coworker. So there's likely to be some utility created for you and that you will feel the glow of virtue, but also quite a bit of disutility as you will be the target of retaliation. As long as the retaliation doesn't reach the point of you getting fired, your dependents will feel some disutility because you'll be more stressed, and that inevitably gets brought home to some extent, but maybe not too much disutility. In a perfect world, the changes made by management would cause your biased coworkers to face their own prior behavior, mend their ways, and become better people, in which case they'd gain a lot of utility from your action. But let's be real, they'll probably just be really pissed off at you and they will resentfully follow the new rules. So each of them gets some disutility from being bitter and annoyed. Similarly, with your managers, each of those three will get some disutility as they resentfully make and follow the new rules. Now, the coworker who was the victim of bias will get quite a bit of utility. We know from decades of research that racial bias is very harmful well beyond its immediate effects because the constant stress causes all sorts of health problems and other knock-on effects. So even if people are grumbly under the new rules, she will get high utility. She might also feel some subtle effects of retaliation, though. Remember that you can weight utility, so hers would be weighted heavily, while your coworkers and managers would be weighted lightly. And your disutility would be lighter than her utility, but still fairly bad, because people are likely to be pissed at you. So we have got 1 unit of heavy utility and 1 of medium, minus 8 units of light disutility, and 2 units of medium to heavy disutility. Since we kept our example very constrained to the reverse, keeping your mouth shut, will bring about approximately the reverse ratio of utility to disutility. Now, according to ACT Utilitarianism, it is pretty obvious you should keep your mouth shut and your head down and ignore the unfair treatment. Notice that the advice will shift if the numbers shift. If there are fewer coworkers disgruntled, or more coworkers being unfairly treated, or different management attitudes, the calculus changes. But in our example, you should not speak up to try to help your coworker. This example illustrates one of the main problems people have with ACT Utilitarianism. It's called the tyranny of the majority, and we'll talk about it in our next video, along with some other major issues. In On Liberty, the mills are, in part, responding to those issues. As always, review your notes and this video, email me if you have any questions, and when you're ready, move on to the next video. I will see you soon. Thanks!